this month we picked a bit of a niche subject. So as I said earlier, it's really great that so many people decided they want to come along and hear about it. And the title, as you see, is Conversions of Houses to Multiple Residences, brackets HMOs. And what we're trying to do here is disentangle all those rules and regulations that are tied up in the Housing Act, or Housing Acts, should I say, and the building regulations and the Building Act. So hopefully by the end of this, we'll have done that. And if we haven't, then yeah, you can ask the questions that are outstanding. So that term HMO, very catchy term, isn't it? A house in multiple occupation. I'm just going to adjust my screen. I'm just not quite where I want to be. Bear with me. Let's put that down there. Excellent. No, sorry, I've got my screen set up badly. That's where I wanted it, I think. Sorry about this. I'll be with you in a second. Right, I'm going to run with that. So, very simply put, it's about houses shared by more than one household. But there's a lot more to it than that, and the definition has been kicked around by various pieces of legislation over the last 35 years. So I'm not going to say much more about HMOs and the rules that apply to them, because I don't have the necessary knowledge and expertise, I'm afraid. And you probably think, well, why don't you get off and let somebody get on who does? Well, I will in a minute. Don't switch off. I know, luckily, a former colleague and friend who does know a lot about HMOs. It's Jane O'Brien. She's the Senior Environmental Health Officer with East Herts District Council. So she's going to talk about the HMO legislation contained in the Housing Acts. And I nag my colleagues and I tell them not to use the phrase HMO, because it's not a building control word. It is an environmental health word. It has no relevance to the legislation that we in building control work under, i.e. the Building Act 1984 and the building regulations. And that's caused quite a confusion for ourselves and our customers on the rules and regulations that apply and who applies them. I'm still messing about with my, yeah. So a few years ago, this was discussed by members of the Central England Technical Forum that I chaired at the time. And the problem was that there were unscrupulous developers and they were working with approved inspectors in the region. And there are, as I always say, there are there's quite a few perfectly good approved inspectors, but there were a few who were exploiting the confusion, shall we say, to carry out or to allow the carrying out of substandard conversions to houses so that landlords could make money renting out poor quality housing accommodation. And this was, I remember, particularly prevalent in Milton Keynes at the time. So the Technical Forum for Central England, we took it on ourselves to try and create some clear and rational guidance for our colleagues in the region. So this is what we considered. Firstly, we thought we need to clarify the three definitions in the building regulations and really find out what defines a dwelling, what defines a flat, and what defines rooms for residential purposes. So for a dwelling definition, we can look at the key terms in approved document B that covers fire safety in dwellings. And this notes that a dwelling can include a dwelling house and a flat, but of course a dwelling house cannot include a flat within it. That should be obvious, I hope. And as we see, it says a dwelling is a unit where one or more people live, whether or not as a sole or main residence, in either of the following situations. So it can be a single person or people living together as a family, or a maximum of 6 people living together as a single household, including where care is provided for residents. So you could have, say, a family of 4. They could take in a couple of lodgers who share their facilities, and that would still be classed as a dwelling under building regulations. If it was a family of 5, then they would be limited to taking in 1 lodger. Otherwise, they would lose their definition as a dwelling. There would be a change of use. Alternatively, it could be 6 students sharing a house and using all the facilities and sharing them. As long as there wasn't self-contained accommodation, it's still a dwelling. And of course, people living together as a family, there's no limit on that. That could be 15 people living in a house. It could be granny and granddad, mum and dad, the children, the grandchildren, Auntie Maud and Uncle Tom Cobley et al. So there's no numerical limit on what would constitute a family household. There would be no change of use. First dwelling. Now, in the same document, we're told that a flat is a separate and self-contained premises constructed or adapted for use for residential purposes and forming part of a building from some other part of which it is divided horizontally. The key phrases there are self-contained, I'll speak more about that later, and divided horizontally. And if they apply after a conversion, then it's created a flat, it's no longer a dwelling house. And finally, the lesser known definition, a room for residential purposes, and that's a room or suite of rooms, which is not a dwelling house or a flat, and which is used by 1 or more persons to live and sleep, and includes a room in a hostel, hotel, boarding house, hall of residence, or a residential home. But it doesn't include a room in a hospital or other similar establishment used for patient accommodation. So that latter hospital criteria, that would apply to, say, a care home where care is provided for the residents. So just a residential home, it wouldn't, but if there's care provided, then it's more akin to a hospital. So it wouldn't be a room for residential purposes, which is particularly relevant when you look at the regulations you apply to those, as you will find out. So using those established definitions, we made reference to the building regulations, and the key part being Regulation 5. And I've extracted the relevant sections on the slide. These are where there are what's termed material changes of use that are controlled under building regulations. And there's a material change of use where there is a change in the purposes for which a building is used, so that after that change, and you've got the cases B, C, G and H. B being the building now contains a flat where previously it didn't. The building is used as a boarding house. In other words, there's 6 or more people living in it, where previously it wasn't. A building which contains at least 1 dwelling contains a greater or lesser number of dwellings, so it's covered in that clause. And also the building contains a room for residential purposes, where previously it didn't. All those are change of use categories that are controlled under the building regs. So that begs the question, what controls then are invoked if you change your dwelling into one of these other uses? And I've just listed, I'll briefly go through them. As you see, most of Part B, the fire safety requirements, are covered. B1, means of warning and escape. B2, internal fire spread linings. B3, internal fire spread structure. And of course, the key requirement there is for compartmentation between flats. Normally we'd be looking for an hour. On a conversion, sometimes you can accept a 30-minute fire separation in the floors, but only up to 3 stories in height. So there is a bit of flexibility there. Also B4.2, that relates to external fire spread and the roof fire rating. For the building control surveyors amongst you, you'll probably note that there's no control on the unprotected area limits for walls, which is B41. And finally, B5, which is access and facilities for the fire service. All those things have to be considered if we're considering an application for a change of use. Other requirements that apply: C2C condensation control, E1 to 3. That's an important one in the list. And there we are looking for minimum standards of sound insulation between the flats or between the rooms for residential purposes. And that also means that we're going to be looking for sound testing, if possible, to demonstrate that the target performance has been achieved. So that's the onerous one that, you know, there's a big cost implication and quite a lot of design considerations for how you achieve that. And as we always say in building control, if you can achieve the sound separation, then generally speaking, the fire separation will fall into place very easily. Just to finish off, yeah, we control foul drainage. That doesn't mean we're going to ask them to dig up the foul drainage, but we might just do a cursory check on that it's functioning properly. H6, solid waste storage. Day 1 to 4, combustion appliances. Let's say it's an old Victorian place, it's got chimneys in it. We would either ask for those chimneys to be checked and you know, proved to be functional and in good condition. And if they weren't, we would ask for the fireplaces to be permanently bricked up if it couldn't be proved to be compliant with regulations, which in many cases they can't in old houses. L1 is another critical one. What you are doing in changing the use, you are bringing in controls on what are termed the retained thermal elements. In other words, the walls, the roof and the floors, they're all required to meet threshold values in the approved documents, but only where that is technically and economically viable. So if you're not going to get a payback on your investment, I think it's 15 years, correct me if I'm wrong on the chat, then you wouldn't be required to carry out the upgrade. A good example of that is if a building was converted that had 9-inch brick walls, sorry, that's old money, but 225mm solid walls, that wouldn't meet the threshold 0.7 U-value target. So you would then be obliged to upgrade to a U-value of 0.3, which can be done internally or externally. Finally on there is part P. Of course, that just means that we would ensure that the wiring system met the IEE wiring regulations, or BS 7671 as it's otherwise known. So when we got to coming up with all this guidance for a local authority building control and colleagues in the region, we thought, well, let's get this out nationally, because it was a national issue, and we thought it might be helpful. And what LABC suggested was, the national organisation, why not take it to the Building Control Alliance? Now, the Building Control Alliance is an organisation that represents private and public sector building control. So if we could get these rules applied across the board, then we thought that would be an excellent thing to achieve. So we took it to the Building Control Alliance. They agreed it was a good idea to bring in the guide. They agreed with the guidance, and quite recently it's now been published as Technical Guidance Note 28, as you see there. There's a link to the website at the bottom where you can access that and other guides by the BCA. And this is where we brought in this title, and it was the best one I could think of, and I get laughed at for it. Conversions to multiple residences, houses in multiple residence. Yeah, there's got to be a more catchy phrase, isn't there? HMO rolls off the tongue beautifully, but houses in multiple residence somehow doesn't. But we needed to differentiate it, and it's certainly done that. So I like to think of it as doing our bit to promote good basic standards of accommodation at the cheaper end of the market. This is where there were problems. And if these sort of conversions do slip through the net and we don't see them and they're long established, then we can always rely on our colleagues in environmental health to step in, and more of that in a moment. Just rounding off, I just show you an image of the flow chart that's in Guidance Note 28, and that shows the reader what regulations apply and when they apply, but don't squint at that too much. Feel free to download it and look at it at your leisure. Here's just a focus in on the key parts of the flow diagram, and it's a good way to summarise what we've discussed this afternoon about the controls on HMO. I nearly said HMOs, on HMRs. So thinking back to those building regulations and processes that we looked at earlier and the definitions we discussed, I'll just quickly go through the process. I'll load my laser pointer, and here we are. So we start at the start, as all best places are, and we ask the question, are the occupants living as a family group? If they are, as we said, there can be 15 plus, it is still a dwelling, there's no control, there's no change of use. If the answer to that is no, they're not living as a family group, then we ask the secondary question, will the property be occupied by more than 6 persons? If it won't be more than 6 persons, then we ask the secondary question, are they living in self-contained accommodation? If they're not in self-contained accommodation, in other words, the situation of lodgers where they'll have a bedroom but they'll share facilities, it's no more than 6, there's no change of use, no change to dwelling status. However, if they are living in self-contained accommodation, no matter how many there are, then it is a conversion to flats and controlled as such under the building regulations. Going back to this question, if there are more than 6 people occupying the building, again, if it's self-contained, it's a flat, it's a conversion to flat. If the residents aren't living in self-contained accommodation, then that creates the rooms for residential purposes, again, a change of use and controlled a different way. So slightly less onerous restrictions in terms of fire separation, but still restrictions on sound insulation, which create a good, healthy living environment. So one thing I will say is I've referred a lot to the phrase self-contained, and I'm guessing that the question will come up on the chat. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is if the basic facilities, and by that I mean a kitchen and a bathroom and a toilet, or bath or shower room, should I say, if they are provided for the exclusive use of the resident, then that is self-contained. If the resident has to share those facilities with others, then it is not self-contained. So hopefully that's reasonably clear. And as I say, that's now national guidance, and hopefully that's in building regs terms, that's clearing some of the confusion and allowing people to apply the regulations consistently around the country. Anyway, I will stop wittering on now and hand you over to my former colleague Jane, who will talk to you about her side of things. So I will stop sharing.
Oops, and I will try and start sharing. So,
right.
Hello, I'm Jane. Let's see if I can manage to share my screen properly. And share again. Yes. Yeah, I'm all about houses. Sorry about that. I'm Jane O'Brien, and as Trevor says, we used to work together at East Herts. Joined there just over 16 years ago now. And Trevor has been a great help to me ever since, I think, and still is. I still get good advice and help when I contact HBC, which is great. Currently, I lead the team in environmental health that looks after the residential premises. And so that includes what we very happily call HMOs. I think one of the problems with HMR is it's a little bit close to HMRC, and they're not always the good guys, are they? So I'm happy with the fact that we're HMOs. Oops, sorry. Excuse me a sec. I've just dropped all my notes. There we go. Right. Let's see if my pointers work this time. Yes. So I'm looking at it from an environmental health perspective. And we do have slightly different views to the building regs side of things. So with simple premise, and I'm sure we both share it, residential premises should be safe and healthy. So coming from that as a start, our main tool that we use at the moment is the Housing Act 2004. That's the main tool, especially when it comes to actually physical housing standards. There are other tools we'll use, but that's the main one. Part 1 of that is all about housing conditions in general. Part 2 is the licensing of HMOs. Part 4, management orders which do apply to HMOs and overcrowding. Part 7 is a massive act, as most are. Tribunals, registers of licensed HMOs, lots of meanings and some definitions, and things like that. Where we require action under the Act, usually by notice, but not in all cases. Some things under the Act end up going straight to prosecution, possibly. Then failure to comply can lead to some quite significant enforcement, up to 3,000 per offence. It does have to be pretty bad to go for that one. Or the alternative will be prosecution, leading to a criminal record. Okay, looking at the first part of the Housing Act, which actually applies to all properties, not just HMOs. 2004 brought in quite a big change from what some people might still know of as the old fitness standard to a much more risk-based, simple risk-based assessment, simple being an odd term for it really, where we're looking at the hazards in a property and the likelihood of them occurring and what the impact of those will be. So the HHSRS is the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, which really rolls off the tongue well. The HHSRS isn't too bad. There's 29 elements that we look at under that. Here's just a few of them, really. So some things in a property will obviously apply to more than one element of the HHSRS. So there's a lot of overlap between electrical and fire. There's a lot of overlap between damp and mould and excess cold. But those are the things we're looking for. And there's some great guidance. And there's guidance specifically written to be used by landlords and property-related professionals. That just cuts it down a bit from our operating guidance and enforcement guidance. But of course, those are out there on the web as well for anyone to look at. Within the risk rating, we're looking at risk to what we call the most vulnerable group. And that most vulnerable group changes depending on the different type of hazard. We'll come on to some specific instances later on, and I'll try and remember the vulnerable groups for them. But for example, falls, some of the falls things, the vulnerable group is actually young children. Some of the cold is older people. And when we're assessing the properties, we don't immediately take into account the actual people living there, but we use it for the most vulnerable group. So that the previous lot applies to all properties, including houses and multiple occupation. But houses and multiple occupation are special. They are really important. As Trevor said, they can provide some of the less expensive rental accommodation in the district. And it's really important that we have them. But there's always a but, isn't there? HMOs often house some of our more vulnerable residents. And that might not always be for some of the sort of more obvious vulnerabilities you think of. Just being young and inexperienced in the rental market is a vulnerability. If I could say it, I'd be brilliant. So that comes into it as well. There's some young, naive people there renting their first property who can be taken for a ride by a landlord, and sometimes worse. So we're looking to protect tenants. We also, sorry, I nearly missed this one here. We've got higher risks to health and safety in a HMO. You don't necessarily know who you're sharing with when you move in. Higher risks around security, around hygiene. You're sharing bathrooms, toilets, kitchens with other people who may not have the same standards as you do. And also, let me think, fire, of course. So you're sharing a flat, somebody else comes in the middle of the night, decides to have some chips. They don't know who's in the flat, and you don't know they're doing something risky. So there is more legislation, there are more controls around HMOs for us, both covering physical property and standards of management, but I'm focusing more on the physical property today. Okay, and we have our own definitions, and they are different to those definitions in building regs and for planning. So the Housing Act section 254 has 3 different tests for HMOs, plus that section 257 one. Standard test is what most people imagine. So you've got a house in multiple occupation. Basically, it's one or more units used by more than one household, where they share same basic amenities. And at least there we're on common ground. So the shared basic amenities are toilets, bathrooms or shower rooms, and kitchens. So if they're sharing them, more than one household, it's an HMO, 9 times out of 10 anyway. We then bring in the fact that it needs to be their sole or main residence. So if it's a hotel, a B&B, that's not an HMO. It has to be their sole or main residence. Can be interesting to try and prove that one. Some form of rent or other consideration has to be paid as well. Okay. Then you've got the self-contained flat test. The standard test specifically excludes flats. The self-contained flat test is exactly what the standard test is, but this is for flats. And the converted building test brings in any converted building that may have a mix of flats, and so self-contained flats and shared units. So that's the 3 standard sort of main tests. Then you've got section 257s. Interesting. To some appearances, that might just be a building converted into flats. And if it's a modern building that's been converted recently properly, then yes, it will just be a block of flats or a group of flats. Unfortunately, if it was converted prior to June 92, or at least, and doesn't comply with the building standards at that time, it certainly hasn't been brought up to those standards, then we still class it as an HMO. It escapes some regulations. It has to also be to more than 2/3 owner, not owner occupied, less than 2/3 owner occupied. So something that looks like it's a normal set of building converted into flats can still be an HMO. We've also got something else, which isn't a defined term, but it does come into our thinking, and that's shared houses. So that might be where a group of people have come together, they've got a single tenancy agreement, but they're actually not the same family, they're not related. They've got a lot of the characteristics of a family. They know each other, they're friends, they look after each other, they're in and out of each other's rooms, all that sort of thing. They don't have exclusive use of a specific unit. Then we might choose to just tone down some of our requirements. The other thing we need to remember is when we're talking about an HMO, it does include the back garden. It's not just the physical building, it includes the back garden, the pond, the river running through the back, and all sorts. So HMO licensing. Not all HMOs need to be licensed. At least in East Herts they don't. Part 2 of the Housing Act includes both mandatory licensing and what we call additional licensing. So mandatory licensing, many people will have heard from before the original introduction of it, before October 18, 3 or more stories, 5 or more people in 2 or more households, and it needed a license. That's actually changed since October. That requirement for 3 or more stories has gone. So any number of stories, 5 or more people in 2 or more households. There are some odd exceptions to that. For example, a flat in a purpose-built block of flats is excluded from licensing. So there's some odd little quirks to it, but in general, if you've got 5 or more people sharing a house, you need a license. So some authorities have used the powers in Part 2. They've extended the definition under the additional licensing powers that they've got, and therefore they might require licensing of HMOs with less than 5 people in them. Licensing brings about it the need for us to actually decide that property is suitable. So is it suitable for multiple occupation for a specific number of people? Because the license people get will say how many people can live in that HMO. 2 main areas of regulations for us that actually help define these tests. There's the original one, brought in 2006 and rapidly changed. Come on to why that was in a minute. And then more recently, in 2018, one been brought in to look at room sizes. And again, I'll talk about those. Within the main act, we have got the opportunity, there's mandatory conditions that properties need to be to. Mandatory standards, that's it. But we've also had the opportunity to bring in some of our own standards. And so you'll find most authorities have got something like a set of amenity standards. The amenity standards will cover the fixed prescribed standards of heating, washing, shared kitchens, fire precautions, space, but also our other matters are things like lighting and ventilation in a property, refuse storage, electrics, gas, furniture, all those things. We'll cover those off in the amenity standards. In Hertfordshire, we've also got a guide to fire safety, and that's agreed between the authorities and the fire service. And that will give you quite a clear idea of what fire requirements are actually needed in an HMO. Fire protection requirements anyway. If I go on to the next slide, if I can, there we go. Looking specifically at fire precautions, definitely got some subtle differences with what Trevor was talking about before. So this is an example, you probably can't see it very clearly, especially if you're not looking at it on a fairly big screen, of what we'd need in a 3-story or more property. We're looking there for a grade A fire alarm system with detection in basically everything except the toilets and bathrooms. And even then, occasionally, we'll go into the bathrooms, very occasionally. We're looking for it to be obviously a link system. It's obviously a grade A system. So you've got a control panel here. We're also looking for protection of the means of escape. We're slightly less concerned about protection between bedrooms. So between, you can see on this floor, between bedroom 1 and bedroom 4, we're just looking for good, sound, existing walls. But between the bedrooms and the means of escape, we want them to be 30-minute fire protected, fire and smoke protected. And then you've got the fire doors on those. And that applies to cupboards on the means of escape as well. So you've got your airing cupboard up on your top floor over here. It'll have a fire door on it. If that cupboard is more than a square metre in area, it may actually also be included in the fire protection system in, with a linked smoke alarm in there as well. So that's what we're looking at for a 3-storey. Moving on to a 2-storey. So I've just taken the middle floor out. Here, grade D1. And the main thing that visually is missing, of course, is the control panel. Slightly a shame, because a control panel means that it's easier for people to see where problems have occurred and that side of it. But we don't demand a control panel on a 2-storey HMO. And that's looking at where the first floor is no more than 4.5 metres up. So people are more likely to be able to escape through escape windows if they're there. The same coverage though, so we've still got detection in all the rooms except the bathrooms. We would still have detection in an airing cupboard or a big cupboard on the landing. That's something more than a square metre. Okay. Between floors, we're just looking at 30 minutes. But of course, if it's an HMO above a commercial unit, then we would want an hour separation between the commercial unit and the residential side of things. Interestingly, with fire doors, we could start to come into that slight conflict between what's required for nice, well insulated homes, where the requirement, certainly with HBC at the moment, is a 4 mil max gap round the door, but a gap at the bottom of the door, there we go there, between 10 and 22 mils. For fire safety, obviously, we will say fit it to the manufacturer's instructions. And typically that's as small as practical around the edges. Obviously, we will have strips, intumescent strips and cold smoke seals in there. And at the bottom, threshold gap, we're still saying shouldn't really exceed more than 8 mils. If that becomes a problem, then we might end up seeing more intumescent type ventilation being put into the doors. But so far, we seem to be avoiding that. Right, moving on to some of the more amenity standard stuff. Washing facilities. So we need to have an adequate number of bathrooms, toilets, basins for the people using it. Once upon a time, that was defined. That definition is something that escaped between the regulations in 2006 and the amendment in 2007. But previously, we were looking at 1 bathroom for 4 people, and that could have the only toilet in the property in it. As soon as you move up to 5, that toilet had to move out of the bathroom, but you still only needed 1 loo. But there we go. They need to be reasonably located. We really don't want people having to run too far up and down too many flights of stairs to get to a loo, especially if they're ill and in shared facilities. And that's where you start bumping into the hygiene issues of shared facilities. This is one of the more contentious parts of the whole of HMO licensing. Where it's reasonably practicable, you must have a wash basin with an appropriate splashback in each unit. We as an authority do use that. It's not the case that all authorities are particularly vicious on it. Not vicious at all, but they don't look to that as much as we do. It's in the legislation though, so we do it. The slight soften of it that came in with the 2007 variation on the regulations was that it wasn't a their must every time. It's just now their must, but we can have regard to the age and character, the size and layout, existing provision. So we've got a bit more flexibility. And we do have landlords with basins in their bedrooms. Some fairly straightforward. We do seem to have missed out on the splashback on that one. And others choose to put in a little vanity unit, just gives a little bit more storage space and everything else. We have had an appeal against a requirement for a wash basin in bedrooms. It went to a tribunal, lots of discussion about what wash basins may be used for, lengthy discussions on that, but in the end the tribunal stuck with us and said yes, we were right in requesting a wash basin. So WCs in properties need wash basins as well. So in the shared ones, where you've got your toilet unit, toilet compartment, it must have a basin in it. A lot of older, well, I suppose 50s, 40s, 50s-ish properties, 30s, you often had the bathroom and next to it there would be a toilet and that wouldn't have a basin in it. So trying to squeeze basins in those can be difficult. And you do have to consider who's going to be using it, but there's a lot more of these units coming out now that actually squeeze the basin into the cistern area really, and it's conservation of water as well. Not necessarily be suitable for all tenants, especially anybody who can't actually kneel on the toilet lid. Very recently, we came across some other interesting challenges with toilets. Luckily here we got in, well, we got in at this point. So you can see on that middle picture, be quite a challenge, especially if the radiator's on, not to, oops, sorry. Let me go back now, see if I can do that. There we go. Not to burn your knees on the radiator if you're trying to use that loo. And the right-hand picture, that sort of scuffed area of the floor you can see there, around here, that's where the toilet was going to be fitted. And the basin was then between that and the shower unit at the back. So to actually have a shower, first you have to climb past the toilet, hit your elbow on the basin, and then get into the shower. It all looked great on a piece of paper, but in reality, in practicality, I think the builders actually called us in and said, are we really doing the right thing here? So sufficient space is required. Quite recently, and we've always had concerns about bedroom sizes. And typically it's in our amenity standards that a single bedroom should be about 8.5 square meters. Recently, new regulations came through and actually took away our discretion at the bottom end of the sizing. So 8.5 square meters used to be okay if there was no shared space. If there was shared space, we'd relax that. Now that bottom end has been defined for us in regulations. And so 6.51 is now the absolute minimum a bedroom can be for an adult. In fact, anyone over 10. When we're measuring height as well, that 6.51 has to have a ceiling height of at least 1.5 square meters. Not square meters, yeah, 1.5 meters. So we only measure the floor area that has that ceiling height. This room is big enough for an adult to live in. Wasn't originally, because that cupboard used to house a hot water cylinder that was shared, and therefore the tenant didn't have access to the whole of the cupboard. Landlord, when we pointed this out to him, took out the cylinder, which was redundant anyway. He'd changed the system before. So now this room is big enough for an adult to live in. And you can see there why, although the minimum sizes are what they are, and that's legislated, we will often require a bigger room, or at least shared space where the person can actually live, because we're looking after their mental health as well as their physical health. Trying to live all your life in a room that size, not really good for you. All right, yes. I've got a few slides here now about some of the issues where we've got a very clear overlap between the Housing Health and Safety Rating System and what we're finding in HMOs. And one of our issues is balustrading. Got quite a few townhouses built in the 60s, 70s who've got glorious ranch rail balustrading. And we don't really like them because little uns can easily climb them. In some cases, I suppose that middle one looks small enough gaps, but where you've got bigger gaps, then heads can get stuck in them, people can slide through them, all sorts of problems. And on the far right, that's a first floor balcony. And you're falling off there onto, well, if you're lucky, a car to bounce off, but otherwise a very hard surface when you fall. So under the HHSRS, we could come up with what we call a category 1 hazard. So everything's rated under the HHSRS. And for those that come up with the highest risk, we have a duty to do something about it. Those at a lower risk, we've got the opportunity to do something about it. So here we had an area that was mixed, some rented, some owner occupied. And as I think I mentioned at the beginning, our legislation is tenure neutral. So we can apply it to owner occupied premises as well as rented premises. In this case, we wrote to them all, trying to find out which was which. On the ones where we know there are HMOs, we've required them to do something about those gaps on the balustrading, on the balcony area, which could be as simple as applying a mesh to the back surface of it to make it less easily climbable and to stop things sliding under that bottom. There's no toe guarding. Where a property is owner occupied, obviously the owner's got more control of what they can do with the house. And so we are in a lot of cases more likely to serve what is called a hazard awareness notice, which simply makes it clear that we've told the owner there is a risk of the property. So that's those. Under the HMO licensing, we've applied conditions on the license that say sort out the internal balustrading, to sort out gaps, sort out toe guarding, and sometimes sort out the height. Another one I came across, this is an HMO being created on the top of a pub. So obviously a lot of it's going to be used for the staff, but it's still an HMO. Even though they're probably getting the accommodation as part of their employment and part of their salary is going towards it, that's still a consideration of rent. And they decided that this sort of balustrading was good enough for the main entrance to the HMO, and we decided it wasn't. So we've been asked to sort that one out. Another area, HMOs are fun. People basically live in a bedroom. And so when you're thinking about converting your property to an HMO, try not to think of the bedrooms as just bedrooms. People can have an awful lot of electrical appliances in them. This is just a simple selection. I've certainly seen people with a nice little hob unit, a portable hob sat on top of a fridge, maybe a rice cooker beside it, all sorts of things. And some of them, you say, drawing significant amounts of power. Certainly in East Herts, we require a minimum of 6 sockets, and they need to be suitably located. We have had someone try to say, oh, well, okay, if I just put another double socket on top of this one, doesn't require too much more chasing out of walls, much cheaper. No, they need to be suitably located around the room. Last one I'm going to talk about, heating and ventilation. Each individual room, each individual unit, bedroom unit, needs to be controllable by the tenant. It's no good landlord having their lovely heating system with one single controller where they set the heating to come on at, let's say, 6 in the morning till 9. That's quite generous for some. And 6 in the evening till 10. And then you've got people working shifts who aren't around at those times to enjoy the heat. And they need to have warmth when they need it. So we need controllability in the rooms. Individual room thermostats and timers, absolutely brilliant. Can't say I've seen that in any of our HMOs, but at least a TRV, so that they have some control of the temperature. If it's wet central heating. If we've got electrical heaters, panel heaters, convector heaters, we do need them to be wall mounted. We do need a fixed heating system, and we do need some control. Ventilation, again, also needs to be controllable, but obviously you've got a balance with windows. We want them to be safe and not have too many people falling out. Bathrooms, toilets, everything else do need ventilation. HMOs, by their nature, a lot of the bedroom doors will be more closed than they would be in a normal house, restricting the cross ventilation through the property. So a good bit of purge ventilation of openable windows is great. That's me done. So thanks for listening to me. And I think we're going back to questions now for if you've got any questions for the two of us. Okay.
Thanks for that, Jane. Really good. And it just shows, you know, yeah, lots of overlapping controls, things we both cover, and some to a lesser or greater degree. But yeah, it did generate a few questions, and what I'll do is, with the time available, I will go through them. Fortunately, people ignored me saying don't ask me any of the tricky ones, and the first couple are when considering, this is Adam, when considering exclusive use for the tenant for self-containment for flats, do all amenities have to be behind the entrance door of that flat unit? Yes, is the answer. To be self-contained, the amenities should be within the unit. If they're outside the flat, then they are usually communal and shared with others. The second one is a bit more tricky, and it's pushing on the sort of grey fringes of the legislation. And here I can only state an opinion, and my opinion is not a magistrate's decision in a court of enforcement. So the question is, would a change of use have occurred where a dwelling house has been converted to 6 bedsits, each with a bathroom and a space with a worktop with fridge, microwave, but no hob cooker? A separate communal kitchen is also provided. Now, as I say, that's a grey area, and I can't give you a categorical answer because there's no test cases to underpin it that I'm aware of. And if there is, then maybe somebody will come through in the chat and point it out. My view is they are still pretty well self-contained. If there is a cooking area, you know, they're all going to have locks. They're not going to be living as a household. And whether or not the kitchen gets used is a question. You know, they could live in a self-contained environment with those facilities that are provided. We would probably say that's a change of use, and if somebody wanted to challenge that, then we would enter a debate on it. So yeah, not as clear an answer as I'd like to have given. A question from Ben. It may have been in regard to something Jane you were saying. Any examples of additional licensing? I'm not quite sure what that related to. You? Otherwise, we'll ask you to come off mute and tell us.
So additional licensing, I don't think Hertfordshire, I'm probably wrong actually, there may be districts in Hertfordshire that have used additional licensing. I'm afraid I don't know which ones they are. So certainly a lot of the London boroughs and some of the bigger cities and areas that have got specific problems with smaller HMOs, whether that's physical problems or quite often management and tenancy related problems.
So it's normally 5 unrelated people. You got registered as a HMO, but I think because they've got a lot of problems, if you've got 3 people, then you want to register it.
Don't want to know.
No one at the moment.
Okay, could you move
You can have 3. Yeah, so one is vacant, it makes sense to just upgrade a couple of things.
I did it myself. There you go. I'm not muted. No, right. Where were we? Yeah, Jane, you were just concluding that question about additional licensing.
Yeah, saying basically, I'm not sure of any Hertfordshire ones that Hertfordshire authorities that have gone for it, but certainly the bigger cities where you've got problems, then yes, they've gone for it, and it does bring it down so that you're no longer just reliant on the 5 or more occupiers. But anything that is an HMO can then be included in licensing.
Excellent. Thanks very much, and apologies for the heckling. Pat Folan, never heard of him. Do East Herts departments ask for risk assessments for HMOs? Do environmental health departments ask for risk assessments for HMOs?
We ask for fire risk assessments, but the enforcement authority for the fire risk assessments is the fire service rather than ourselves. So we ask for them, and if we don't get them, then we'll pass that on to fire and rescue and they can enforce on that. We'll also have a good look at them when we come in and explain where they need to do better. We sometimes would rather that a fire risk assessment was actually done by the landlord, where they've got some capability, because at least then they take ownership of it. We're not so keen on those that people go out, they pay for a fire risk assessment, goes on the shelf, never look at it again. And obviously when we do our inspection, we are assessing some of the fire risk. So what we require kind of covers most things anyway. Okay.
Hopefully that answered the question. I'm curious about this one. Jane, have you conducted a reliability and cost benefit analysis between the Part 6 Grade A system and a Part 1 L system? Now, I'm assuming that there are references to BS 5839. And my thoughts are, well, why would you? Because Part 6 is the one you would apply to an HMO. But Jane, have you done a cost benefit analysis?
No, we've not done a cost benefit analysis. And in fact, we get a lot of support from Fire and Rescue, who did a lot of the information on our fire guide, and we follow what they're asking for a lot of the time. We have a requirement to consult with Fire and Rescue anyway. So we do that. It kind of helps both ways because it lets them know where the HMOs are, if they need to send out extra appliances and things like that. But also they come back and tell us, no, you've missed some bits and pieces, so require an extra alarm here or that sort of thing.
Yeah, good to hear. We both clearly have an excellent relationship with good old Fire and Rescue.
Oh yes.
Right, just going on down. Ben Langford says he loves a splashback. Well, some people are easily pleased, but there you go, Ben, if that's your thing. Can you remind what you work to a minimum size for a WC area? That's for you, Jane, I'm afraid.
Yeah, okay. And there was a comment on that one about a British standard again. We don't particularly work to a minimum size. We look to something that's usable. So we also take into the shape of the room, how things are. If you can get, well, certainly if you can get me able to use the WC, then chances are it's good.
Fine, I see that question did move on. Sorry, I hadn't seen that there was a bit more chat on that, but to get the presentation sent over. All our presentations are on our website. You can, you can watch them daily if you want to. If you've got some. So yes, we don't usually circulate slides, but we happily circulate the video. No problem there. Somebody thought something was a good answer there. Hopefully it was one of mine, but probably not. And a few comments. Hugo, house newly converted with 4 rooms, each with kitchenette and bathroom, WC basin shower. House also has it's the same question again. It's got a shared kitchen and bathroom for all. Does this count as an HMO? Oh, it's one for you, Jane.
Yeah, you got the word HMO. We would look at it. Are they sharing some amenities? Yes, they are sharing some amenities. And it also depends. We're a little bit fussy about the size of a kitchenette. So the previous answer wouldn't have been good enough for us as a kitchen in your room. You do need to have sufficient facilities in there, and just a microwave is pretty tight. So I think it would count as an HMO, but we would actually have to see it, because otherwise, why are you putting in a kitchen and a bathroom if you're not expecting it to be shared. So we'd look at that as an HMO.
Mhm.
Okay.
Okay, well, that's come to the end of the question. If there are any further questions and anything that's more site specific, anyone wants to ask, then I'm hopefully, Jane, if it's any starts, you don't mind being contacted, and I don't mind being contacted about any building regs issues anywhere in Hertfordshire. So have that in mind and send us a line if something else comes to mind, or if you feel that any of the questions have not been answered fully. Always have to do that. So that concludes. Let me thank you, Jane. Really good.
No worries. Thank you very much.
Mucking in, you